It was another painful day for Bucci. 3 months had gone by since his wife, Nena, passed away. Every evening since then, he would sit by the riverside, quietly weeping because he needed to escape his mother's constant nagging. Bucci, you must be strong. You have a baby to care for. Your wife left you with a newborn, his mother would say. Nena had passed on while giving birth to their daughter, Ozioma. As the sky darkened, Bucci knew it was time to head home. He stood up and began the walk back, taking the village path. As he turned a corner, he bumped into someone carrying a load on her head. "Watch where you're going," she snapped as her luggage tumbled to the ground. Her voice froze Bucci in place. He knew that voice. "Chinwe," he whispered, barely able to get the words out of his mouth. But even at that low volume, Chinwe knew it was him. She could recognize his voice at any pitch, anywhere, and at any given time. It was the voice of the man she had once loved, Bucci, the man who had broken her heart to marry Nena. Back then, they were inseparable, known throughout the village as lovebirds. Chinwe had supported all his wild dreams, and when he finally achieved success, he left her for someone else. To escape the shame and whispers of the villagers, Chinwe moved away from the village. But now she was back, forced to return due to a war in her new village. Chinwe Bucci repeated, this time louder. "How are you, Bucci?" she asked, trying to sound composed even though her heart raced. She thought she had buried her feelings for him, but seeing him now brought them rushing back. "I'm sorry, Chinwe," Bucci started, but she quickly interrupted him. "It's okay. I hold no grudge. You and Nena are a perfect couple." Bucci's face fell, and then he told Chinwe about Nena's death. When Chinwe heard the news, she didn't know how to feel. However, she was not sad. "Let me help you carry your things home, Bucci," she offered. Chinwe hesitated but then agreed, wanting to spend more time with him. Slowly, they walked to her hut, catching up on the years they had missed. When they arrived, Chinwe lit a lantern, and Bucci began to help her tidy up. The small space brought back so many memories for both of them, memories of their youth spent together in that very room. Unable to bear it any longer, Chinwe spoke. "Bucci, you knew I was an orphan. You knew how much I loved you. That's why it was easy for you to hurt me, because I had no one to stand up for me, and I was too in love with you to fight back." Tears filled her eyes, and Bucci moved to hug her. He had never meant to hurt her, but something about Nena had captivated him in a way he could not explain. They held each other for what felt like an eternity. Soon the flood of emotions became overwhelming, and one thing led to another. That night, Bucci and Chinwe made love. In the days that followed, their affair continued. Though Bucci was mourning, Chinwe made him feel alive again, reminding him of his youth and wild spirits. Then one day, Chinwe gave him news. "I'm pregnant, Bucci." Bucci froze, his mind racing. With their frequent nights together, it wasn't surprising. "Let's get married," he said after a pause. "I know you will be a wonderful wife and a great mother to Ozioma. We will be a family of 4, and who knows what else God has in store for us." Chinwe was overjoyed. After all these years, she was finally going to marry the love of her life. They quickly made plans for their wedding, and soon after, Bucci and Chinwe were joined as husband and wife. 24 years had passed since Chinwe and Bucci's marriage, and much had changed. Bucci was now late, and Ozioma, along with her younger sister, Ndidi, had blossomed into beautiful women. Yes, Chinwe had a baby girl for Bucci, and as he had thought, she was a devoted wife to him and a loving mother to both daughters. But something happened that tested the love she believed she had for Ozioma. One day, Ndidi came home with exciting news. A suitor whom I met at a ceremony hosted by the king has expressed interest in me, Mama, she said. He will come with his family in 2 weeks to meet you. Ndidi said, her face glowing with happiness. Chinwe was overjoyed at the hope of Ndidi getting married. Ozioma, overhearing the conversation, also rejoiced for her sister, unbothered by the fact that Ndidi might marry before her. The long-awaited day arrived, and as promised, the suitor, Eyina, arrived with his family. As the maids served refreshments, Ozioma joined in to help, ensuring everything went smoothly. But when she entered the room carrying a tray of food, Eyina's attention immediately shifted. He couldn't take his eyes off her, captivated by her beauty. "Beautiful maiden, what is your name?" Eyina asked, his voice full of admiration. Before Ozioma could respond, Chinwe quickly intervened. "She's my daughter, Ozioma. Ozioma, go help your sister prepare to meet her in-laws," she instructed, hoping to divert Eyina's attention back to Ndidi. Ozioma did as she was told, but the damage had already been done. Eyina could not stop thinking about her. He pulled his father aside and said, "Papa, I am not interested in Ndidi. I want Ozioma." His father frowned, shaking his head. "This is embarrassing. How do I break this news to her mother?" But Eyina, arrogant and confident, replied, "Papa, they are wealthy, but we are wealthier. She'll be happy to offer us either daughter." Reluctantly, his father agreed. When they returned to the gathering, just as Ndidi was about to be presented to her future in-laws, Eyina's father interrupted. "We are not here today for Ndidi. It is Ozioma we wish to take as a wife." Chinwe froze in shock. Ozioma and Ndidi, listening from the next room, were equally stunned. But Ozioma would not stand by and let her family be insulted. She stormed into the room and family addressed the suitor's family. "I am not interested in marrying your son. He came here for my sister, and now he has changed his mind. Please leave. My family will not entertain this marriage any longer." The suitor's family, seeing Ozioma's seriousness and Chinwe's silence, had no choice but to leave. Once they were gone, Chinwe hugged her daughters, but inside she was angry. Memories of her own betrayal resurfaced, how Buchi had left her for Nena. Eyina's words kept ringing in her head. "Beautiful maiden, what is your name?" Many nights, she lay awake, unable to find rest. Chinwe paced around her room, fists clenched, as her hatred for Ozioma deepened with each passing day. At last she made a vow. Her daughter would never suffer the same fate she had, no matter the cost, not while she was alive. An evil smile crept across her face. Nena had escaped her revenge, but Ozioma would not be so lucky. She would make sure of it. Now all she needed was the perfect plan. 3 months had passed since the incident, and while everyone else had moved on, Chinwe could not. Day and night she walked tirelessly, crafting her evil plan. Whenever doubt crept into her heart, she would whisper to herself, "This is for Ndidi. She deserves a better life." Ndidi, however, remained indifferent, staying close to her sister, but Chinwe convinced herself that Ndidi was too young to understand. One evening, after Ozioma finished her tailoring lessons, she began her usual walk home. There was a lonely path she often took, and as she approached it, she heard her name called from the bushes. Startled, she turned around to see her mother stepping out. "Mama, what are you doing there?" she asked, surprised. "My child, I was on my way to the land at Ozioma. A buyer is coming tomorrow, and I wanted to do a final inspection," Chinwe replied. "At this time, Mama, you'll come home very late, and there's no clear path to Ozioma. We have to go through the bushes," Ozioma said, concerned. Chinwe reassured her. "Don't worry, I'll be fine. You should go home and rest. You must be tired from your lessons today." But Chinwe knew Ozioma too well, and as expected, Ozioma offered to go with her, unwilling to let her mother make the journey alone. Together, they set off for the distant land at Ayina. Finally, they reached the land, but to Ozioma's surprise, there were 3 men inspecting the area. "Who are you people, and what are you doing here?" Chinwe asked, approaching them quickly. Ozioma followed her mother, scared they were going to hurt her. But as they reached the men, they circled her and grabbed her, while Chinwe quietly stepped aside. "Good, grab her," Chinwe said. Ozioma soon realized what was happening and began to beg her mother. "Mama, what did I do? Please, tell them to let me go." But Chinwe replied, "You think you are so special, right? I won't let you ruin everything the way your mother ruined my life." Terror filled Ozioma's heart as the men dragged her toward a hidden entrance behind thick bushes. Beneath the undergrowth lay a heavy wooden door, barely noticeable against the earth. One of the men pulled it open, revealing a dark, damp stairway leading down into the ground. "Please, Mama, don't do this," Ozioma pleaded, her voice shaking as she tried to fight off the men. But Chinwe remained unmoved. She watched her daughter being lowered into the underground prison, a place she had prepared for this very moment, a place no one in the village knew existed. Once Ozioma was locked inside, Chinwe and the men sealed their pact with a blood oath. She had paid them enough money to ensure their silence, but she needed more assurance. "You will keep watch over her for 10 years. If she survives, leave her in a distant village. She will never dare return," Chinwe said, her voice cold. The men nodded in agreement, and after sealing the deal, they each went their separate ways. Every day, Ozioma alone in her dark cell, waiting for her mother's forgiveness. Panic and disbelief consumed her. She pounded the walls, screamed for help, but all that answered was the hollow echo of her own voice in the cold, damp darkness. As the days turned to months, her hope of being rescued slowly faded. The men who brought her food and water came in silence, their faces emotionless. At first, she begged them to let her go, but eventually she stopped speaking to them altogether. The damp air weakened her body, and she grew thinner with each passing day, but she clung to life. Some nights she cried herself to sleep, mourning the life and future that had been stolen from her. Other times she burned with anger, anger at Chinwe, at the men, and at the world that seemed to have forgotten her. Back in the village, Chinwe organized search parties, pretending to look for Ozioma. Each time they returned with no news, she would fall to the ground, wailing in false pain. Ndidi cried bitterly, even searching for Ozioma herself, but found no trace of her sister. After a year, she finally accepted that Ozioma was gone, though she kept her memory alive in her heart. When Ndidi married 3 years after her sister's disappearance, she wept because Ozioma was not there. When she had her children in the 5th and 7th years of Ozioma's absence, she mourned deeply. But still, Chinwe remained unmoved. It had been 10 years since Ozioma disappeared, and many things had changed in Isiama. The village now had foreign guests, white people from England who had come in search of the crude oil that the land was rich with. King Achor, who was used to trading with neighboring villages, was surprised by the arrival of these white men. "We want to build factories that will provide jobs for the youth of Izama." These factories will make your village the top trading center in all of Nigeria, said Nathan, the leader of the team. Upon hearing this, King Achor was thrilled. Greedy as he was, all he could think about were the benefits he would gain from the deal. Give me some time to think about it, he replied, though he had already decided to agree. Within a week, he summoned the foreigners and gave his approval. I will support your plan for the benefit of my people, King Achor said. To show my support, I will grant you access to many lands for your search for crude oil. The guests were pleased with the king's response. They informed him they would be back shortly to begin work as discussed. In their absence, the greedy king began seizing lands from the villagers, targeting those he believed had untapped oil reserves. Among these lands was one owned by Chinwe, where Ozioma was secretly imprisoned. When Chinwe learned of the king's decision, she panicked and quickly began making plans to move Ozioma, but the king was faster. He had already sent guards to secure the lands because he knew the villagers would rebel. Helpless, Chinwe ran to the palace to plead with the king. My husband is dead. I've lost my first daughter, and now the king wants to take my properties, she cried. But the king ignored her. His love for wealth outweighed his compassion for his people. Chinwe began living in constant fear, hoping that by the time Ozioma was found, she would have already perished from hunger and thirst. But her time was up. It was time to pay for her sins. 7 days after the guards took over, a new set of guards arrived at the site. During a break, one of them wandered to a corner of the land to urinate. As he did, the sound of his urine hitting the ground seemed louder than usual. Confused, he looked around and saw what appeared to be overgrown bushes. Intrigued, he used a stick to clear the bushes and uncovered an old withered wooden door covered in vines and dirt, as if someone had tried to hide it. His curiosity grew. He knocked on the door, and to his surprise, faint movement could be heard from below. "Hello?" he called out, knocking louder this time. From beneath the door, a weak voice responded. "Please help me," came the faint whisper. Ozioma usually would not speak, but from the way the door to her prison was handled, she knew it was not her captors. Startled, the guard immediately alerted the others. Together, they broke the door open. One of them lit a lantern and went down the damp staircase, followed by the others. The air was musty and thick with the smell of decay, but small vents hidden in the walls provided enough ventilation to make the space breathable. As the light from the lantern illuminated the room, they saw her. Ozioma, huddled in a corner, her body frail and weak from years of isolation and starvation. One of the guards screamed in shock. "There's a woman down here," he shouted. Ozioma slowly looked up. Her face was bony, her clothes ragged, but in her eyes there was a spark of hope. After a long time of suffering, she had finally been found. Ozioma was swiftly brought before the king, who was in the middle of a meeting with the visitors, who had returned as promised. The guards were ushered in, and the king shook his head in shock at the sight of Ozioma's condition. Nathan, the lead engineer, was filled with empathy as he saw her fragile state, but he quietly observed, choosing not to get involved. The guards laid her gently on the floor and recounted everything that had happened. After a long silence, the king asked, "Who is this woman? Does anyone know her?" A palace maid who had been listening closely stepped forward, saying, "I may be wrong, my king, but she resembles late Buchi's daughter. She was declared missing over 8 years ago." The king immediately ordered the guards to fetch her mother, Chinwe, to tell her the good news. When they arrived at Chinwe's house, she opened the door, took one look at them, and collapsed in tears. "Please don't do this. I didn't mean to hurt her. I'll pay you all handsomely if you help me leave this village," Chinwe begged. The chief guard quickly realized what had happened. He had always wondered who could have kept Ozioma hidden, knowing it was Buchi's land. He grabbed Chinwe's arm and shouted, "You wicked woman! So you're the one responsible for this cruelty?" The other guards, now understanding the truth, began to shame her and dragged her to the palace. Inside, Ozioma sat quietly in the corner, sipping water and eating. When she saw Chinwe enter, tears rolled down her face. Her mother was visibly older, and Ozioma silently wondered how many years had passed. Chinwe rushed toward her, pleading for forgiveness, but the guards held her back. They explained everything to the king, who immediately ordered Chinwe's arrest and sentenced her to execution. Then the queen spoke up, asking that they keep Ozioma in their care until she was strong enough to be by herself at home. "My king, I am a doctor, and I believe Ozioma would benefit from my care," said Elsie, one of the foreign guests. The king agreed without hesitation, and Ozioma was promptly taken to one of the rooms in the palace for treatment. Months passed, and Ozioma went through periods of treatment. Some days were good, while others were painful, but she pushed through them all. Ndidi, her sister, who now lived in another village with her family, heard about all that had happened and rushed over to see her. However, Ozioma was not ready for a visit. "I really want to be alone," she told Elsie, but Ndidi was determined. She loved her sister deeply, and after some persistence, Ozioma finally agreed to meet with her. They talked, and in the end she said, "Please give me time, Ndidi. I'm still trying to process everything that's happened." Ndidi finally understood. With a nod, returned to her home, relieved that she had at least seen her sister. One day, when Ozioma was strong enough to walk, she left the palace. Though she still limped, she moved slowly through the village, taking in its changes. She wanted to speak to the villagers, but did not know how to start, so she began muttering to herself, something she had gotten used to during her time in captivity. "Is she talking to herself?" one villager whispered. "What do you expect after all that time in isolation? She has probably gone mad," another replied sadly. Hearing this, Ozioma felt a deep sadness. She wanted to correct them, to tell them they were wrong, but when she approached, they fled in fear. Heartbroken, she returned to the palace and asked for an audience with the queen, who had grown fond of her. "I'm ready to go home, my queen," Ozioma said. "Thank you for all your kindness." The queen tried to convince her to stay longer, but Ozioma felt out of place even in the palace. She believed everyone was judging her. Eventually, the queen agreed and sent her home with enough money to support herself until she could start earning again. "I'll send food to you every 2 weeks," the queen promised as she bid Ozioma farewell. Ozioma moved back into her father Buchi's old house and isolated herself, which only fueled the rumors in the village. Some called her the mad woman who lived alone in the abandoned compound. Children avoided passing by her house at night, fearing she might come out and harm them. Despite everything, the queen kept her promise, and Elsie frequently checked on Ozioma, bringing her medications. But one day, Elsie could not make the trip, so she asked Nathan to deliver the medication on his way to the work site. "You can't miss the house. It's right before the turn to the road that leads to the major work sites, Elsie explained. When Nathan arrived at Ozioma's house, there was no one outside, but just as he was about to leave, he heard someone giggling at the back of the house. "Hello," he shouted, but there was no response. Rather, the person kept giggling. As he got closer, the voice suddenly called out, "Sing louder." He assumed it was Ozioma and walked to meet her. When he saw her, she was busy singing and making hand movements as if she were orchestrating a choir. Nathan thought about interrupting her, but it was the first time he had seen her so joyful. He remembered visiting the king in his private chambers to discuss the factory when he had heard loud screams. "Never mind the noise. It's the woman that was saved from captivity. The herbalist is massaging her legs so she can walk better," the king said to him. Aside from the day she arrived at the palace, Nathan had often seen her sitting sadly on his frequent visits to the palace. He had wanted to approach her, but he didn't think she would be receptive to him. He stood aside, watching her as she conducted her invisible choir. Just when he thought that was finished, she broke into a dance, moving her body to the tune from her mouth. Nathan decided he would leave and return later, not wanting to invade her privacy. But as he stepped back, his feet knocked down a small structure, making a loud noise, immediately alerting Ozioma, and suddenly she screamed in fright. "Please, don't be scared," Nathan said reassuringly. "Elsie asked me to deliver your medications." Still flustered, Ozioma, still flustered, backed away, her mind racing. She was sure he thought she was mad, just like the others. Tears welled up in her eyes as she struggled to explain. "It's just a way to pass the time. Please, do not listen to what they say. I'm not mad," she said quietly, avoiding his gaze. Nathan took a step forward, his expression soft and understanding. "Ozioma, I don't think you are mad," he said reassuringly. "We all find ways to cope with what we've been through." His words seemed to ease her discomfort, and for the first time, Ozioma felt like someone truly understood. He handed her the medications he was asked to deliver and turned his back to leave. But just as he began to walk away, he thought to stay and talk with her a bit. She could do with some company, he said to himself. He turned back and took a short look at Ozioma, thinking of what he could say to make her feel more comfortable. "Back in England, when I was a boy, my sister and I used to hum tunes," he began. "She's a lovely singer, so I was always dragged into her displays. We would pretend we were conducting orchestras in our garden. Music can be a kind of medicine for the soul, don't you think?" he asked her. Ozioma looked at him, a bit surprised by his words. She hadn't expected someone like Nathan to share something so personal. She relaxed a little, the tension in her body easing as he spoke. "I guess what I am trying to say is you don't need to explain yourself to anyone," he said gently. "What you're doing isn't madness. It's a way to feel alive, to find joy again. After everything you've been through, you deserve that." Ozioma blinked, her heart warmed by his words. She hadn't expected such kindness from him. For a brief moment, she allowed herself to smile, something she hadn't done in a long time. Nathan, sensing she was beginning to open up, added, "Maybe one day I'll join you, but I warn you fair, I'm not the best dancer." He laughed lightly, hoping to lighten the mood. Ozioma chuckled softly. Nathan, noticing her shift, said, "If you ever want to talk about music or anything else, I'll be around." He nodded warmly before turning to leave. But Ozioma had more questions. "What exactly are you and your team doing in our village?" she asked. He turned, looking at her excitedly, and began to share the lovely plans he had for the village, which would benefit the villagers and his team. "Thank you for asking me," he said. "Most of the villagers do not want to talk to us. The first time we came, they were friendly, but now they seem very distant. The workers on the site quietly work. They hardly associate with us." Ozioma looked at him, surprised, and said, "Well, have you considered that it might be because you're taking their lands? People talk, and I heard stories while I was living in the palace." "Their lands?" he responded, puzzled. "The king gave us this land for the project." Ozioma was awkwardly silent, and immediately Nathan understood why. "You mean the king forcefully took the land from the people?" Nathan asked, concern creeping into his voice. Ozioma nodded slowly. "Many of the lands he gave away have been in families for generations. It's not just land, it's who we are," she explained. "You can't just take that and expect people to be okay with it." Nathan, taken aback by Ozioma's comments about the land, paused for a moment. In England, land deals were usually straightforward. If the authorities gave permission, that was all that mattered. But here in Azama, things were different. The land was sacred, carried the villagers' history, identity, and livelihoods. "I had no idea," Nathan said quietly. "I thought we were helping." He looked down at the ground, feeling a pang of guilt for the role he had unknowingly played in the villagers' suffering. Seeing the sadness in his eyes, Ozioma decided to ease his burden. "Well, you probably need to get back to work. Thanks again for bringing the medications," she said, waving them in the air. Nathan turned to leave, but just before he was out of sight, Ozioma called out, "Wait, I don't even know your name. What's your name?" He paused and smiled. "It's Nathan, Miss Ozioma. My name is Nathan." Ozioma chuckled as he walked away, amused by the way he said her name. "Ozioma," she repeated, laughing at his accent. At night, as Nathan was falling asleep, he thought about how to find a solution that would calm the villagers whose lands had been taken without making the king angry. But his mind kept returning to Ozioma and how much she needed a friend. "I'll ask Elsie if I can deliver her medications from now on," he said to himself before finally drifting off. The next morning, Nathan went to see Elsie with his offer. She agreed with a smile, noticing how eager Nathan was and realizing he was trying to form a friendship with Ozioma. Days turned into weeks, and Nathan diligently visited Ozioma every morning for his delivery. He would purposely go early so they could have time to chat before he headed to work. Each time he came by, Ozioma felt her world growing a little brighter. She had been so used to the silence, the loneliness, and the feeling of being forgotten, but Nathan was different. He never treated her like she was broken or mad. He simply showed up, asked her how she was, and truly listened. Nathan didn't push her to talk about her past, or did he offer false comfort. He was just there, steady, reliable, and kind. Sometimes when he arrived very early, they would cook and share a meal together. "Maybe I could come back later this evening and we could take a walk together," he suggested one day during his frequent visits. But Ozioma's countenance changed. "I don't think we should. Besides, I have a limp. It will take ages for us to get to our destination." "It's okay. I have the time," he countered, but she immediately shot back, "I am not interested. I don't want anyone to make fun of me." Nathan understood and changed the topic. The following week, in the morning, while Ozioma waited for Nathan in the morning, she suddenly heard an explosion. The blast shook the air, and her heart pounded in fear. She rushed to the window and saw villagers running toward the land where the workers had been. The noise, the smoke, something was wrong. Her thoughts immediately turned to Nathan, wondering if he was safe. Without hesitation, Ozioma grabbed her scarf and hurried outside. Her limp slowed her down, but she was determined to know if he was okay. As she walked through the village, she heard people murmuring about the explosion, their voices mix of fear and curiosity. Some villagers stared at her, whispering, "Isn't that the mad woman?" But she didn't care. All she could think about was Nathan. By the time she reached the work site, she saw the crowd gathered near the edge of the fields. Her eyes scanned the area, and then she spotted him, standing near the smoke and talking to one of the engineers. Relief flooded her body. Without thinking, she limped toward him, ignoring the whisper of villagers. When she reached him, she threw her arms around him, hugging him tightly. "Nathan," she said, her voice trembling, "I thought something happened to you." Nathan, surprised by the sudden embrace, gently wrapped his arms around her. "I'm fine, Ozioma," he whispered. "It was just a controlled explosion." The villagers, watching from a distance, began to murmur more loudly, surprised by Ozioma's boldness and Nathan's gentle response. But Ozioma didn't care. For the first time, she felt safe, knowing Nathan was unharmed. As hours passed, the villagers slowly began to leave. Nathan settled Ozioma under a tent, and eventually he joined her. "Thank you for coming to check on me. It really means a lot," Nathan said gratefully. "Are you sure you're okay?" Ozioma asked, her voice filled with concern. "What exactly happened?" Nathan smiled and glanced around as if making sure no one was listening. "All right, I have a confession, and I trust you to keep it just between us." Nathan began, and Ozioma nodded in agreement. He explained that the explosion was a planned demonstration with the engineers. "We're going to tell the king that these lands are unsuitable for drilling because the explosion triggered a chemical reaction with the oil, making it too dangerous to proceed." Ozioma's eyes widened in surprise. "But why would you do that? Isn't this project important to you?" Nathan smiled and explained that he and his team had managed to befriend the workers through many conversations. The worker revealed which lands belonged to the royal family, so the foreigners decided to focus their drilling efforts on those areas instead. "The land belongs to the villagers. I couldn't, in good conscience, take it from them. The king may be greedy, but he's also superstitious. If he thinks the land will bring disaster, he'll abandon it, and ownership would eventually return to the villagers." Ozioma felt a wave of gratitude wash over her. "Thank you, Nathan," she whispered, her voice filled with emotion. They sat in silence, and finally, Ozioma spoke up. "I don't want to hide anymore, Nathan. I was locked away for years, and now I've built another prison for myself by worrying about what people think." She said Nathan was excited to hear her say those words. "I'm going to start doing the things I love again. I loved making dresses before everything happened. I loved taking walks, and I loved going to festivals. I want to do all of that again. The villagers can think whatever they want. They're wrong, and it doesn't matter." Nathan smiled with admiration. "Well, we can do it together. I'm always here for you," he said. They looked at each other. They obviously cared for themselves as lovers would. To Ozioma's surprise, he took her hand and said, "I know this might seem sudden, but I care for you. I care deeply, and I want to be a part of your life. I want to walk beside you, not just today or tomorrow, but for as long as you will let me." Ozioma blushed. her mind racing with reasons why she should not get involved. But she quickly stopped herself. She deserved a love this kind and gentle. Smiling, she said, "Yes," knowing that Nathan had already shown her time and again that he was her safe space. From then on, Ozioma and Nathan were always together, crossing off activities on each other's bucket lists. At first, the villagers mocked them, but as they saw Ozioma doing well and noticed the king beginning to give up the lands, just as Nathan had predicted, they slowly became more accepting of the couple. Either way, Ozioma didn't care. She was focused on living life to the fullest, and their opinions no longer mattered. The two were deeply in love, but there was one last thing Ozioma knew she had to do: reconnect with her sister, Ndidi. Ozioma traveled with Nathan to visit her sister Ndidi, who welcomed her with open arms. They embraced, tears flowing as they caught up on all they had missed. Ndidi then brought out her children for Ozioma to meet. "This is my eldest daughter. I named her Ozioma after my beloved sister," she said, and Ozioma hugged her niece tightly, along with her other children. Ozioma then introduced Nathan to Ndidi and shared the exciting news that they were planning to get married in a month. Ndidi was overjoyed for her sister, proud that she had found happiness and overcome their late mother's cruelty. Ozioma's reunion with Ndidi was the final piece of healing she needed, and as they embraced before she and Nathan set off for Azama, Ozioma knew she had truly reclaimed her life. Surrounded by love from both her sister and Nathan, she was ready to move forward, stronger, braver, and more determined to live fully. Thanks again for listening. If you enjoyed this story, please like, subscribe, and share it with your loved ones. Until next time, take care and goodbye.